Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen im Literaturhaus. Ich möchte Sie ganz herzlich im Namen des Schweizerischen Instituts für Auslandforschung und des Literaturhauses begrüßen. And I'm very happy to have Lea Ypi here tonight. Welcome, Lea Ypi.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, it should work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for coming and for having me here.
Mein Name ist Gesa Schneider, ich bin die Leiterin des Literaturhauses. Wir werden heute über dieses Buch sprechen, Frei, Erwachsenwerden am Ende der Geschichte. Es ist dieses Jahr im Surkamp Verlag erschienen in der exzellenten Übersetzung von Eva Bonné. In case you're wondering, Lea Ypi understands perfectly well German, so she is included in everything I'm saying now. Lea Ypi versteht Deutsch, sie spricht Englisch, Französisch, Albanisch, Italienisch, and I don't know how many other languages as well. She is a philosopher. She was born in 1978. I say this because it's relevant for the book, for this memoir. She just published also an academic treatise on Kant. She's a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics. Her memoir, Frei, was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for nonfiction, for the Costa Prize for biography. It was a Sunday Times Memoir of the Year and chosen as a book of the year by The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The New Statesman, among many others. And now it is here in German. She is here tonight, not only as a philosopher, but as a writer. Her memoir is first of all a wonderful read, a precise, gripping, tender, melancholy, and very funny account of her childhood in Albania. And at the same time, it shows how important it is to remember not only the big events, but also the small, and how complex a phenomenon freedom is. I would like to thank my friend Martin Meyer for this and the CIAF for our collaboration. We invite 4 times a year important contemporary thinkers who take into account the world how it was, how it is, and how it could be. We invited Anne Applebaum, Jill Lepore, Aleida Assmann, to name a few. And last but not least, I would mention that this place, die Museumsgesellschaft, was for a time, and perhaps again, I hope, a center for intellectual activity. In 1916, Lenin was a member and used to read here in the room next door. Not only Lenin, but Trotsky. They were here at the same time. So I think it is interesting to remember and to know that we are in a very strange proximity here to the bigger currents of history. We will talk about 50 minutes, and then you will have time to ask questions in any language you like. Basically, please translate your questions in German or English for those who are more ignorant. Lea, your book takes place in Albania from the 80s to 97 mainly, and focused on your childhood and youth, your relations in your family, and the complex story of your country. And it extends to a reflection on universal subjects. And we will try to talk about all this. It is first of all a book of literature. I would really like to mention this because we are here in a Literaturhaus. But I would like to start with the surface. Can you tell us more about the cover? It's the same cover in English, in the English book and in the German book, and it's you see it and you see this Coca-Cola bottle and a rose, and you, as a Western person, you don't really think more about it. But it has a deeper meaning, I assume.
So yeah, the cover picks up in part on an episode described in one of the chapters of a book, which talks about the fallout between my mother and a neighbor over a Coca-Cola can. So, and the background sentences that need to be said about this was that a Coca-Cola can in the Albania of the 80s wasn't a Coca-Cola can. It was actually a marker of Western freedom. It was a marker of a world that was not accessible to Albanians. it was a marker of a kind of consumerist society that was both hated by the official state propaganda and craved by the people who lived there. And at one point, it also became a marker of social status, because it was the only thing that could tell apart an Albanian that had always been in Albania, lived in Albania, not known anything other than Albania, from an Albanian that had had encounters with the West that could be shown in the form of exhibiting this Coca-Cola can in their houses. And this is why a Coca-Cola can, as I say, wasn't just a Coca-Cola can. In fact, it wasn't even known to be a Coca-Cola can. Very few people, I for one, didn't know what Coca-Cola was when I was growing up. But I knew what this can was, and I knew what this red can was. I saw it in the houses of people we visited. They would be exposed in their bookshelves, sometimes very often right next to a photo of Enver Hoxha, the leader of the Albanian, historic leader of the Albanian Communist Party. And so it was as prized as the photo of Enver Hoxha. They were right next to each other. And they were often also, well, they were always empty, actually. So, and this is why I say I didn't know that it was supposed to hold Coca-Cola, because it was just a can. But the can symbolized this meeting between the Albanians that lived in Albania and the Albanians that somehow had access to something that was not Albania, and that were bringing that into their homes by exhibiting it. And the chapter in the story, in the book, talks about this fight that my mother had with our neighbor, one of our most trusted neighbors, over the disappearance of a Coca-Cola can that my mother had bought secondhand in her job by a colleague, empty. And this simultaneous appearance of that can after it had disappeared from our shelf onto her bookshelf, which turned out to be a coincidence or not, who knows, we never knew, but basically led to my mother and this neighbor fighting over who had stolen the can from the other. And again, it was a bit also a symbol in the book of the discord that Western imperialism would bring to Albanian society and so in tightly knit networks of solidarity.
You mentioned Enver Hoxha. There's another story between these neighbors that shows also a sort of, I guess, solidarity, because you are told as a child that you're not allowed to say that your parents don't have a framed image of him. And perhaps you can elaborate a little bit about that, because it also shows another aspect of the society you lived in.
Yeah, so I need to correct something small but important.
Okay.
It's not that I was told that my parents don't like him. I could not have been told that.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
I could only be led to believe that there was something strange going on between my parents and Enver Hoxha, which sometimes took the form of, we don't have a photo of Enver Hoxha because we're waiting for a really nice one to be produced. And so we will only have it when that nice comes, or when it's your birthday, or when you deserve it. And so my childhood was shaped by this noticing that my family didn't have a photo of Enver Hoxha exposed, and a number of my friends had a photo of Enver Hoxha, and asking, but why? Why don't we have a photo of Enver Hoxha? Everybody has a photo. I want a photo. I want to have it right next to my bed. And my parents not telling me, we don't have it and you can't have it, or we don't like it, because they couldn't say that, but constantly making excuses for why we didn't have it just yet at that point. So it was a constant longing for something that somehow never showed up in my house. And that's because the larger story in my book was that throughout my childhood, there was an exposure to two different sources of formative influence, both of which went along in parallel with each other, but unknown to me. And so on the one hand, the influence of the state through the education system, through the school, through the neighborhood network, through the media, through the official propaganda. And then on the other hand, the formative influence of the family, which sometimes took the form of these mysteries that I grew up with, like the not having the photo of Enver Hoxha in our living room, or like reacting in a certain way during his funeral, or like being spoken French to when I was really young at an early age, which weren't quite signaling that my family were dissidents, but which were signaling that I somehow stood out from other children, from other families.
Before we go to the really interesting part about how your family is composed and what they represent as well. I was just realizing I don't even know how long Enver Hoxha was Minister of Albania. Perhaps can you tell us just a very small history lesson for those?
Yeah, so where do we want the history to start?
I don't know.
I don't know. Shall I start? Albania independence. 1912, Albania becomes independent from the Ottoman Empire. And 1946, it becomes a communist state. And I often say this is very important because there's only these 34 years between when it's an independent state and when it becomes a communist state, which is, if you think about official Marxist theory of how communism becomes, communism is the last stages of history almost. It's when, you know, nature turns into freedom and where the world has undergone all the developments that it needs to undergo to become mature for this society of goodness and humanity and so on. And so communism replaces capitalism, but of course Albania, when communism arrives to Albania in 1946, is not a capitalist society. There are no factories, there are no workers, there's mostly peasants, mostly people who have not really gone through school education. A very small minority of the population can read and write. And again, I say this is because it's important, because communism is supposed to arrive in a society with a mature liberal bourgeois sphere like the one Lenin and Trotsky were studying in Zurich. And so it's important that that communism comes to Albania in 1946 and is part of the national resistance against the fascists and the Nazis. And this background is also important because Albania has been, and it was part of the official ideology, subject of an Ottoman Empire for most of its existence, pre-independence, and then an independent state, but then with an authoritarian king, and then under fascism, under Nazism. And there is this national liberation effort shaped in part by the Communist Party, which then succeeds in hegemonizing the resistance movement and emerges victorious from the Second World War. And Enver Hoxha is the general, one of the figures involved in this anti-fascist resistance movement, who then becomes quite central in the Socialist Party, in the Communist Party, which then becomes the Labour Party of Albania. And the Communist Party of Albania then undergoes different phases of different coalitions and alliances with other countries. It goes through a small alliance with Yugoslavia, which is pivotal in the national resistance against the fascists. It happens with the Yugoslavs. The Yugoslavs are also crucial in the founding of the Albanian Communist Party in 1941. Then it breaks up with Yugoslavia for reasons that we may or may not want to talk about. Then it has a coalition with the Soviet Union, which is broken at the point in which Stalin dies and the Soviet Union goes through de-Stalinization, and Albania protects this kind of purity of Albanian communism by maintaining its loyalty to Stalin. Coalesces with the Chinese, but then the Chinese also turn too moderate and are not good enough, and so it breaks this alliance with China. And when I was growing up in the 80s, it had basically more or less broken ties with almost every country that there was out there in the world, both capitalists, which had been the case for a long time, but at that point also socialists. So for my childhood and my education, it was really important that Albania was, as the slogan went, the anti-imperialist lighthouse of the world. And so that every other country was looking to us for a model of how you uphold this rigorous loyalty to communist ideals when everybody else has sold out, including the Soviet Union, China, Yugoslavia, Cuba, Vietnam, whatever, you name it. Yeah, crash course.
Thank you. That was amazing. I know much more, and I you know, a bit, of course, when you read your book, but you have this in a very systematic, consequent way. You have the vision, the eyes of a child. You don't break this really in your book. So you are in the book this curious, eager, overachieving child trying to please everyone and yourself. And where did you see the discrepancies between the official narration and, I don't know, the gaps?
So I think I was ambitious, obviously. I guess I am still as a child, but I don't think I stood out in being willing to do things and in being a good citizen. The rhetoric around me was of you need to be a good student, a good pioneer, you need to work hard, learn as much as you can learn, read as many books as you can read, all in the context of very severe censorship. And in part, this severe censorship explained the fact that there was this yearning for knowledge that shaped society at all levels. And so that, in that sense, I didn't stand out. We didn't have obviously iPads and things like that. We had very limited access to television. We had some children's books, which we had to read sometimes many times. And so I had to read the kind of classics of adaptation of children's classics from Homer many times, because that was just what I had. And you start thinking about different perspectives on the same story. And so I don't think I was unique in terms of being a prodigy. I think I was like every other child was growing up in the society of the kinds of limitations that I was growing up with. But where I was unique was that there are some things in my family that stood out from other families. And one of them was the fact that, as I mentioned, I grew up speaking French. And so... And
you haven't mentioned it here, I think. So your first language was French because of your grandmother?
Yeah, my grandmother was speaking French to me, and there was a story behind this which I ignored for most of my childhood. I didn't really know why I spoke French, but I knew that French made me stand out from other children. In part because my grandmother used it as a language to tell me, you know, this person needs to go home now, when I was playing with a friend in French. And so it's kind of, then the friend becomes alienated. But it was basically my encounter with the world was mediated by a language that was not my language, was also not my grandmother's language, very obviously. She did not, had never been to France, did not speak French with an accent, had clearly no relatives in France. And so there was no obvious ethnic connection to France. But there was a connection, which was a very important one, which was very important also then for my identity further on, which was a class connection. And the reason she spoke French to me was to preserve that class identity. So she grew up in Salonika in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, and in an aristocratic family that spoke French as a matter of course, as all aristocratic families did in the Ottoman Empire in its last years. The Ottoman Empire almost died when it modernized, because the more they tried to modernize, the less they could catch up. And then somehow some people say that that's what marked the kind of the death of the Ottoman Empire. But basically, in the last 50, 60, 70 years of the Ottoman Empire, France was the model after which the Ottoman elites aspired to be. And so French was spoken in all these high elite Ottoman families. It was spoken in Salonika because that was one of the centers. And she came from this very cosmopolitan family for which French was the language of the elite. And the way, she never explained this, she never articulated it afterwards, but I thought of it. The reason she spoke French to me from a very early age was not to give me a language that I could use, because for them, I would never be able to travel outside Albania. Albania was close to the world. There was nothing you could do with French. So what else could you do in teaching a child a language other than preserving through this medium one's identity or one's class identity? And this is something I discovered very late, when I discovered the family stories and the background and the fact that I had grown up in this dissident context without knowing it. But that throughout my childhood was one of these mysteries where I remember asking, you know, why do I have to speak French, when I got annoyed and they said, oh, you know, it's the language of the French Revolution, or you like Les Miserables, don't you like Cosette in the puppet show, and things like that. And so it was a process of constantly asking questions and getting answers that were evasive and somehow not getting quite to the core of things.
And this is also your grandmother. This book is dedicated to her, and she is a sort of a moral instance as well in the book, or for you. But before getting to that, there are other aspects of your family tree, I might say, that are very interesting. So your grandmother, Greek aristocrat speaking French to you, she married a man who was the son of a minister, and you were told always you had no relation to that person.
Yeah, so I started by saying, when I was talking about this importance of the anti-fascist resistance to Albanian communist identity, was the fact that the communists had come to power by defeating the fascists and the Nazis. And so when I was growing up, we celebrated heroes of the Second World War on the 5th of May, and often party secretaries used to visit the neighborhoods and meet the families of descendants of heroes, of people who had died, sort of martyrs of the war. And again, one of the mysteries of my childhood was that not only did we not have any relative who had participated and got killed in the war. But the one thing we did have was that my father had the same name as surname as a fascist prime minister who had been pivotal in passing the crown of Albania to Italians when they occupied. So he'd been working for the king, who was this authoritarian right-wing figure that I explained, and who, at the point in which the king ran away and the Vittorio Emanuele, so the Italian king, took basically ownership of Albania as an entity, was the one who gave the crown of Albania, passed it to the crown of Italy. And so was basically the equivalent of the Vichy government in Albania and the Maréchal Pétain, the kind of equivalent of the Maréchal Pétain. So not only did we not have communist heroes to celebrate, but we had this character who had exactly the same name and surname as my dad, Lea Ypi. And I was told throughout my childhood that, you know, people happen to have the same name and surname as someone else. And you just had to kind of tough it out. And what can we do? It's a disgrace. So, and I remember in school, sometimes the name came up, or sometimes the name came up in family conversations, and always feeling uncomfortable about this character whose name and surname unfortunately happened to be the same as my dad. And I only learned in 1990, when the system came down, that it was not a coincidence, that he was, in fact, my great-grandfather. But my family had never admitted to me the blood relation, because they worried that I would talk to people about it and I would make it very clear that I had this kind of fascist background and somehow be singled out as a fascist myself, and all my narrative of being a good citizen in a good communist country would crumble.
And your parents as well, so they represent, I mean, they have very different opinions on how to read the world. And you describe this very well in the book. So sometimes I wonder, as a child, or even now writing yourself as a child, do you have more sympathies with your father or with your mother? It's like two sides of one coin, or is it really two opposites? And how did they get along?
Well, they sometimes didn't, and sometimes did. And to me, I don't know if I have sympathies. I think there were points of my life where I was more sympathetic to one or the other. Perhaps early on I was more sympathetic to my father, and now I'm maybe more sympathetic to my mother. In a way, they're a model of how in a society people can have different opinions, but if they all want the same thing, then the struggle is okay if it finds a way of being mediated that is acceptable. And so I started this book and wanted to write this book as a book on freedom, and wanted to talk about the ideas of freedom in the liberal and socialist traditions and how they get interpreted and institutionalized in each of these traditions. And in some ways, my mother and my father really represent that. They are characters through which I talk about different conceptions of freedom. And so my mother is someone who is much more libertarian, sort of free market believer, someone who thinks that freedom is to be free from the state interfering in your life, and to have freedom of thought and freedom of association and freedom of expression, and you're free if nobody tells you where to go and what to do and how to dress and so on. And she gains her freedom in post-90 Albania, because that's when these were all the freedoms that were absent during communism and came to us with the transition. And my father has a slightly more, I'd say, social idea of freedom, or positive idea of freedom, which is that it's not enough to be free from, you also have to have the freedom to. You have to have opportunities, you have to be able to flourish and to realize your capacities. And so if you're someone, so maybe the state doesn't tell you what to do and what to dress, but if the state, for example, contributes in creating social structures that leave people unemployed, then that's also not a significant freedom. If if the freedom to sleep under the bridge is not a robust freedom. And my father was very strong in articulating this, and in some ways has this perspective on freedom, this positive perspective on freedom, which I think complements my mother one. And so I think of them, yes, in some ways as antagonistic, or at least they've been historically presented as antagonistic, but I think more plausibly should be thought of as a kind of philosophical dualism. A good society needs both kinds of freedoms. It can't just live on one. And you see the limits of one when you see just a society that only realizes one.
Das Buch ist voll von solchen Szenen, von sehr, sehr schönen, kann man sagen, filmischen Szenen und Parallelmontagen. Und das macht den Reichtum auch dieses Memoirs aus, dass es eben immer wieder changiert von großen von der großen Geschichte zur kleinen. But back to this aspect of biography. What is this? This is sort of a construction of your own history, or how you survive, and would let you aren't free again to do what you would like to do, what you would like to study.
Yeah, so biography actually isn't my construction. It was the term used to talk about people's family background or their position in society. But for me, for a very long time, it was one of these words that are so recurrent in conversation and so much around you that they become the kinds of things that it's almost stupid to ask, well, what does it mean? I don't understand what biography means. So biography always occurred in the context of something or to qualify something. So I didn't know what biography was, but I knew that a biography was good or bad, that could be cleaned or stained, that if I had a new friend at school, I would overhear them saying, what's their biography like? Or if my mother had to prepare a document for work, someone would ask her, could you write a few lines on your biography? And my dad always started by saying, we have a very good biography. And it was so not true that we had a good biography, but you had to start with that sentence because people wouldn't carry on reading what was written afterwards if you didn't have a good biography. So somehow we had discovered, we had a story that some of our ancestors had been pivotal to the Albanian Renaissance in the 19th century. And so we could say we have a very good biography because we contributed to the Albanian intellectual movement that made the Albanian modern state independent. So this was like 200 years ago. Obviously, 20 years ago, there were much more problematic things that happened. But this was not part of our biography. And so it was one of these words that accompanies you throughout your life, and you don't know what exactly it means, but you're also afraid to ask what does it mean for fear of either looking stupid or in the way in which children sense there is something so big going on here that I can't press that button. It's this kind of mystical thing. That it was a word that placed people in the world. And it was the thing that would have stood between me and my ambitions if communism had continued in Albania. And so one of the things that I often think about, and sometimes people ask me about, is the fact that when communism fell, that was the only point in which the biography was made clear to me. And the fact that I had grown up my entire childhood spent in a country where I believed that the country stood for freedom, that I was contributing to build this country, that I was going to be a good citizen, but that at one point of my life it would have been revealed that my biography would not have made that possible because I would have always been a class enemy. And because my family, my mother's side were property-owning bourgeois, and my father's side were these aristocrats who had also fallen out with the state for political reasons. Basically, someone who came from that family background, someone with that biography, could never advance through the ranks of a socialist state. But as a child, I was convinced that I could advance through the ranks of a socialist state, and my parents did nothing to stop that from being the case and from me believing the case. And sometimes people ask, are you angry with your parents that they lied to you? And I think at the time in which they revealed the truth, I was kind of angry because I felt I was old enough and that they had explained complex enough other things to me that why did they conceal this to me for so long? I could have understood if they had explained it or if they could have found ways of telling me the truth. But I think the reason that they did not do it was in part to protect themselves and for fear that, that this child could betray them and go and talk to people that they didn't trust about their family background and put them in trouble. But in part also because I think they saw that I had this ambition and this aspiration that they didn't want to kill too early, and that this ambition somehow would transfer into something else, either if circumstances changed or if they didn't change, I would be mature enough to know how to channel it when I discovered the truth and that it was just not early enough. And so that was the power of biography, was that it was this kind of mystical concept that had everything you needed to know about yourself, but that was also the thing that you never could ask about yourself.
There are also sort of the mystery of language is also the mystery of codes and to decode situations in which you find yourself in. And the way you do it is when you read the book, you follow really you have the same amount of information as a reader as you have as a child. So you have these discussions on university. I just think it's interesting if you tell us just a little bit about that part, because it's also somehow related to biography.
Yeah, so the story is one of a childhood of mysteries, and one in which the reader enters the book with the same information as the main character, and then discovers the information as the book progresses in the same way in which the child discovers the information. And part of the reason for setting up the book like that was intentional. I wanted to write a book about freedom, and I think one of the most important things to understand about freedom is that freedom is something that you can only look for yourself. You can't be given freedom. And as a reader, it was important for me to mimic that in the process of writing, to reflect that in the process of writing, by letting the readers be free to follow through with the book and to kind of discover the truth as it unfolds. Because it was, again, the kind of thing where nobody can give you the key. If I had started the book by saying, I think this about socialism, I think this about capitalism, I think you should think this about capitalism and socialism, and match my reflections and my intuitions as a writer, I don't think the book would work in the same way. It's only if you can enter someone's being and someone's life and kind of grow with them that you can then understand better how they see the world. Which means that then even if you have a conflict, or even if you have a political disagreement, or even if you end up not sharing their view, at least you know better how they got to that view. And for me, that was really important, because this is a book about a divided society. It's a book about concepts that are often misunderstood and misinterpreted, and people fall apart over these concepts. And so it's important to engage with these concepts in as open mind as possible. And for that, the reader needs to trust the writer, that the writer is not being paternalistic and guiding them and manipulating them. And so I wanted them to enter the book with the same degree of ideology, commitment, and to be manipulated as I was manipulated as a child into these concepts, and to follow through the secrets of my childhood just the way in which they were revealed to me. So the universities was one of these big secrets. I was in this family where everybody talked about universities all the time. Sometimes I think that's why I ended up being an academic, because I was like from very early on, everyone talked about universities and education, and someone went to university in this place and it was hard, or they studied this other subject or it was easy, or they dropped out because they couldn't make it, or the teacher were really terrible at this university, but this other university they were better. And this was something that I was constantly exposed to, these discussions from my very, very early on, very early childhood.
I didn't get it, really. I didn't. I was really in the position as you as a child.
Yeah.
It was really, So I let you continue your story.
Well, I will be spoiling it for those who haven't read the book. But fine. Okay, shall I spoil it?
Yeah. Oh, right. Right. No, don't spoil it in that case. Don't spoil it. Oh, that's mean. That's mean. But the book is still... No, you can spoil it, because the book is still great. And there are so many things in it. And this is just a small spoiler.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I will just say this, and then people hopefully... Yes. I will say this. When my parents spoke about universities, they spoke about educational institutions, but of a very particular kind. Places where people go to be educated, but not quite in the same way in which they get educated at university, where, they go and a teacher teaches them and lectures them and they learn things. They still learn things, but they learn it in a particular way. And the way they learn it shapes how they engage with the environment, whether they make it or don't make it, whether they survive or don't survive, and so on. So I think that's enough.
That's perfect. That's perfect. But I still think that it's a good moment to talk about the Untertitel of your book, Coming of Age at the End of History, because still you describe this one system, and then you've been living for quite a while in another system, and you don't really say one is better than the other. I mean, you give us some hints of a possible future, and I was thinking this title, Coming of Age at the End of History, of course, you have always to think of Francis Fukuyama. Is there this association in the title?
Yeah, and so Fukuyama writes about the end of history that arrives in the world with the defeat of the socialist bloc and the end of the Cold War, and this idea that the triumph of liberalism. And one thing he writes in that book is, if you want to know about the end of history, you don't ask an Albanian. So one of the reasons this book has been written with this title is like, well, maybe an Albanian can tell you something about the end of history.
Did he react?
No, I didn't. I mean, I didn't say it to him. He just writes it in his book, and I wrote it
sure,
in mine.
but
So if he reads my book, he'll find out. No.
Okay.
If he reads my book, he'll find out. I found out by reading his book. So
okay.
we have this kind of, we're communicating with our texts. I haven't been in personal relationships about this matter with him.
Okay.
So yeah, but the irony, and it's an ironic title, because the irony is that history did not actually end in the 90s, and liberalism did not win definitively in the 90s either, although this is something that we only know with hindsight in 30 years after. It is a book that is in some ways a tale of two systems, but what is important to me is not so much the story that we say about the systems, but the story that we can tell about how we engage with those systems. And when I talked about the different ideas of freedom, the third idea of freedom that I didn't mention, which is the one that is more important to me, is the one that my grandmother has, which is this moral idea of freedom. So my grandmother, as I said, I started by saying she was in some ways, she had this aristocratic background and came to Albania. Her husband was deported, had a very hard life, was the single mother for many years. Most of her relatives had ended up committing suicide or becoming spies or whatever, losing themselves in one form or another. And she's in the book, in some ways, the symbol of the most oppressed person that you could think of, someone who had everything and lost everything. And what stood out for me about her when I talked to her was that she insisted she had always been free. And when I said, well, there's all this oppression, and she said, well, but I never lost my freedom. And I thought, how can someone who's lived their entire lives in communist Albania, under these circumstances of being the enemy of the state, say that they were always free? And she said something that I think was, in a way, the motivation for me continuing to do my work and studying and believing what I believe, actually, which was, look, no system, however oppressive they are, can ever take away your dignity as a human being. And insofar as they can never take away that dignity, there is a dimension of freedom that is the most important dimension of all, which is a moral dimension. And that is the freedom to choose good from evil when you're asked to make compromises, when you're asked to live these humiliating experiences, and to set yourself, it's the kind of, the freedom that the Stoics speak about, the freedom of the slave. You can be a slave, but you still have your inner freedom and your inner dignity, and that's not something that circumstances can take away from you. And for me, that freedom, that kind of moral dimension of freedom, is the lens through which you can assess the societies in which you live, and you can think about critiques of those societies and whether they realize that freedom or not. So in a way, my grandmother is the moral compass of the book, because she has a conception of freedom that enables you to engage with every institution out there, with every state, with every society, in a way that remains critical by asking yourself, am I living in a moral world or not? And if the answer is no, what can I do to make that world a one that reflects this moral conception of freedom more? So I think, then the story about the different systems is added to that. But the philosophical core of the book really is about the freedom that we discover when we discover the moral capacity of every human being. And that moral capacity is not something that is given to you by a system, and is not something that a system can ever take away. You just have it by virtue of your humanity.
But still, you have you have been living in these two. In 1990, there has been the crash of the system in Albania, and then there has been this total switch. So you really lived from one extreme to the other, the total stalinistische Staat and the total liberale economy. Sorry to say this in this really bad English. So it was really from one extreme to the other. So I was wondering, how do you position yourself then? I mean, with this moral compass, has Kant to do something with this?
So I think the way to see it is to see it, yes, as these extremes of institutionalized freedom in one case or another. So these efforts to kind of realize this inner freedom and to see what happens when the state becomes responsible for it, or when you think that the market is now responsible for it, when the new categories change. But it's also the story that I say in both parts of the book is one of trying to see how the world gets shaped for people with certain ideological categories. And so in communism, there is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and there's the party, and there is an effort to emancipate the workers. And in the liberal period, there is civil society, there's anti-corruption discourse, there is the narrative that individuals are responsible only for themselves, and if markets fail, then we have to tough it out and accept these responsibilities. And so it's a story of how every effort to deliver freedom comes packaged with certain ideological categories. And sometimes for the subjects who are there living with these categories, they're just as abstract. So, in one world, you're in the world of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the promise of freedom for communism in the whole world. And in the other world, you're in the world of structural reforms, of being required to make sacrifices and to take the costs of shock therapy in Eastern Europe and the costs of falling out of liberalization and privatization in the name of a freedom that will also come to you, because when the markets work, it will work for everyone. In both cases, there is a kind of eschatology of freedom and a kind of ideology of that eschatology, which looks different in the different systems, but which is still there and shapes the way in which we see ourselves in society, and also whether we have hope or not, whether we think, how do we cope with the difficulties, how do we survive through the struggles, by having this idea that one day, now the myth is Albania will be part of the European Union and we will be all happy and survive the difficulties that we're facing now. So there is always a messianic element to freedom, but which, in order to be sustained, requires a kind of ideological apparatus that works differently in different societies. And so the story in the book, in those two different parts, is about the concepts through which freedom is packed when we engage with it on a day-to-day level. And again, I talked about how I started this book as a philosophical book, but one of the most important tropes in philosophy is this, for people who are interested in this Platonic element of the cave. So people are in a cave, and when they live in the cave and they don't know about the world outside, they think that the shadows and everything that goes in the cave is reality. And then at some point, one of the prisoners, Plato says, comes out of the cave and sees the world, and at first sees the sun, the real sun, and it hurts his eyes because he's never seen the sun, and understands that he's the only one who sees the shadows in the background. And that's a little bit a good metaphor for ideology. Ideology is the kind of thing that makes us live in a cave and think that this is the real world, but there may be an alternative truth out there that we hardly have access to if we don't question the categories, if we don't try and find the sun and try and think about what is the light and how does the light reflect on the cave. Or, Descartes is another one where you have this idea of the evil genius that manipulates people. And so I think it's part of philosophical tradition to ask yourself, what is the difference between appearance and reality? And can everything that appears to us as real, is it really real?
There is also a part where the narrative, the you in the book, tries to find also, particularly in the end, new solutions for this dichotomy, and says that the important thing is the nuance, that you don't have to think in one category or the other, that there must be some sort of a third way. And you describe this as well, and also in different interviews, that there should be a possibility for a transnational democracy, or perhaps I got it totally wrong, but I was just wondering, how do you think a transnational thinking or solidarity or thought now that in the current situation of the crisis we are actually in, and the renationalization of, necessarily of societies?
Yeah, so I think this is not something that a single author should answer.
Yes.
Or that a single author should be asked to answer.
Okay, yes.
Because in a way, it's part of the problem, I think.
Yes,
that
you're
we
right.
think a particular individual might have a good idea of what to do with the world. In
Yes.
fact, I think the problems of the world have mostly come when people convinced themselves that they had a good idea and went on trying to convince the rest of them that this was a good idea and they now need to implement it. So
Yes.
I talk about the importance of democracy, because for me, democracy is a process, and it's not something that you know from the beginning how it will work out. But what you do is you have a kind of moral compass, you have some guidelines of what you want to see achieved once you interpret the world in a certain way and identify the cracks in the system, in the societies in which you live, in your social, day-to-day social and political relations. So as part of my philosophical thinking outside the book, and I don't give my manifesto in the book, and I hope people read the book as a book that does not try to give you a manifesto, but rather force you to ask certain questions about yourself and about your own society and your own relations. But
and also your own background, where do you come from, why do I think how I think,
exactly.
etc. Where are my blind spots? How could I change certain patterns which I think are normal but they're perhaps not? This is really interesting.
Yeah, so for me, in my other academic work, I try to think about what is democracy and how does democracy relate to freedom, and what kind of freedom can we create through social institutions in which we engage and we open up these spaces for proper exchange that reflects this moral ideal that animates all of us. And for me, that is in part a work of social critique, and that's why I think intellectuals are important and shouldn't shy away from that. They shouldn't tell you, so they should still exchange and give you their ideas. But I think it's a process, and it's a process where all of us have a voice, and no voice is better than another. None of us has the truth, and none of us has the kind of moral high ground to be able to lecture others on how the right society should look like. Because I think that is the danger to democracy. It's exactly when people convince themselves that they have great ideas, that they understand the world better, that they have good solutions, that problems arise. And so on the one hand, I think it requires conviction, but on the other hand, it requires the humility of conviction. And these are two really difficult things, because if you're convinced, then you can't be humble. And if you're humble, you think that you don't have anything to say. So it's kind of tricky.
How can you solve that? Because some people really have good ideas and should be heard.
Yeah, but I think this is why democracy is crucial, because if you have democratic mechanisms in place, then you have institutions that enable all of us to give the best of us in this institutional process that we create. And so, of course, we have critiques. I mean, so I think a capitalist society, for example, is just not a moral society. A society in which people instrumentalize and exploit and are driven by profit cannot be a society that is driven by moral ideals, right? So that's, to me, that seems very simple. But one thing is to say that, and another thing is to say, okay, how do I open up democratic spaces through which that exchange can take place in a way that doesn't make me just impose my view on others and force it upon them, but make them understand that there is a common ground from which we inhabit and we kind of find solutions and look for alternatives. And so it's this, I think, awareness of fallibility and sensitivity to history and the history of people who think that when they know the truth, then you can just go around and spread it to the world, that should be our starting point.
Before I open up to the audience, I would just like, so you define yourself, or define is also a big word. One of the definitions would be that you still teach Marxism, and you would define yourself as a Marxist, and you said that your grandmother and your father were not happy at all that you studied philosophy and especially Marxism. How would they sell that to the community? How I mean, is this a real question for me, because I can't define myself at one thing or another. How can you define what is Marxism for you then?
Okay, so in part, defining myself as a Marxist is a provocation, because why should I not define myself as a Marxist? So this is in part the kind of challenge to my family. You bring me up to be autonomous, but there's one thing that I can't do, namely read and be interested in Marx. And so that's, if they succeeded in developing an autonomous person, then they should be happy that they have developed someone who is willing to challenge their convictions and so on. So that's the more kind of anecdotal part. Having said that, I didn't end up with Marxism because I wanted to challenge my family. I studied philosophy at the end of a very traumatic year for me. This year that's described in the book, 1997, was when pyramid schemes in Albania collapsed and there was a civil war and the school was shut. And everybody had Kalashnikovs around, they were shooting in the air, the country was on the brink of breakdown. And I had to decide that in that year, and this is important, I'm going to connect it to Marx, but I need to make this kind of biographical parenthesis to explain. I had to decide at the end of this year what to study at university. And my dad and my grandmother, my mother had left Italy because she was at one point caught and she jumped on a boat and left. And so this is also the story that's told in the book. But my grandmother and my father were saying, you need to pick a profession. And now imagine a teenager, 17 and a half years, who is in a country on the brink of civil war, where there is a war. And, every day my grandmother would say to me, you need to pull the bed a little bit further away from the window so that you don't get killed by the Kalashnikov bullets that would fall on the windowsill. So if your bed is right next to the window, you will be in danger and you will die. And if it's a little bit further away, then maybe you'll be saved. Imagine in that context, someone who has the decision to decide what to study at university. And, you know, you can't study law because there is no law. There's anarchy around you. The state doesn't control the monopoly of force. You can't study economics because pyramid schemes have just collapsed and people have lost all their savings and the economic system in which everybody believed is just not there anymore. How can you study medicine when people are just dying and, you know, this idea of plain humanity that animates medicine is just gone? So I remember thinking every single profession that I could think of as something to become in the future made no sense whatsoever. And all I had were questions. And in a way, I thought, okay, what can I study that helps me ask better questions? And this is how I ended up studying philosophy, because I was reading philosophy and I was reading philosophical literature, and philosophy was the science of knowing how to ask the right questions. And so I went and studied philosophy in Italy because I had no idea what else. It's a kind of science where you question yourself all the time, and it's okay to have more questions. It's not a problem. You can't make a living with it, but maybe you can. And so I went to Italy and started studying, and, you know, I remember my dad had this whole thing because in Albania there was a stereotype of philosophy teachers were basically people who had studied Marxist-Leninism and often were spies, and so he was completely obsessed that if you studied philosophy, you'd be like a spy, or have the temperament of a spy, and kept saying to me, do you want to be like this? Do you want to be like this? All these people who were spies that we had known throughout our lives. And I said, no, don't worry, I won't study Marx. There's so much more to philosophy than Marx, but just let me do this because I have no idea what else I could do, and I don't think I like anything else, and I can't be motivated. And then I went to Italy, and I started reading Plato, Aristotle, Hume, Leibniz, Descartes, Kant. I was really interested in Kant. Then, because I was really interested in Kant, I started reading the Hegel's critique of Kant. And from Hegel's critique of Kant, I got to Marx's critique of Hegel. And so I had gotten to Marx because of my interest in philosophy. And when I got to Marx, I couldn't say, well, now, I'm sorry, I'm backtrack, go and find another philosopher because your family doesn't like it. So it was kind of spontaneous. And perhaps there was something inherent, and there was an interest in something that somehow had connected to my history, my family, and to my grandfather, who was in prison and was reading Marx and so on. So I'm sure there was a biographical element there as well, but it was a spontaneous process.
But so just last, when you say you're a Marxist, what does it mean in one sentence?
I'm an anti-capitalist.
Okay.
So I think capitalism is wrong and immoral and needs to be abolished. And
okay.
Yeah. But I don't think of Marx as a god, you know. I mean, I think all these philosophers, they're just giants on whose shoulders we step and sit and look the horizon, and so they're all tools. They're all intellectual tools. So it's not that I think Marx has the truth and not John Stuart Mill or some other, or not Nietzsche or whatever. I think history is a parade of characters from which we learn and with the help of which we engage with the past and think about the future. So, yeah.
Let's open for the discussion. We still have, it's a bit longer than 50 minutes, but it's still okay. Yes, I'm going to go around with this mic.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your book. I finished it. Can you hear me with the mask? I finished it on my birthday on Sunday, and what I found so amazing was kind of the point of view that you create with this child that is in a way extremely naive, and as you say, we learn. And you're a professor of philosophy, and I was just wondering when reading it, how did you create this character? How did you kind of strip away all the knowledge that you have, built in the past 30 years and got to this kind of mindset of this kind of 10-year-old girl who's just very involved in this country? And the other question I have is, the story that is told seems very compelling, the story of the state and wanting to be a good citizen. And I got the impression that you felt you had kind of a place in the world and it gave you a structure. And maybe in the process of writing this perspective, what did you learn about the potency of propaganda, or, you know, of a good story? Yeah, that's my question.
So the first question, I think it's true that philosophy is in some ways for philosophers, but I'm also convinced that philosophy is for everyone, actually. And so it was obviously difficult because you were in this lecturing mode and you're only writing academic books, and I was also writing this book in parallel to a book about Kant's First Critique. And, you know, don't try and buy that book because it's going to be really hard, and it's not just very expensive, but also just really hard to read. So I was doing this kind of real technical philosophy on the side with this other book. But I think in the end, the concepts are the same. And so there is a language of how you engage with these concepts that may be more technical or more less technical. But I think I'm convinced that philosophy is for everyone. And that, in fact, that's part of believing in democracy, is that I don't have this idea that some people who are educated and who know a lot more and have read many more books are wiser in the philosophical sense of wiser than people who don't have this. For me, the moral instincts and the drive, the thirst for knowledge that comes with being a kind of moral agent are for everyone. And from children to adults to people who are educated, not educated, and so on. And so it's, in that sense, it wasn't hard. Sometimes I checked with my kids, you know, if I was writing a paragraph, my 11-year-old helped me, and I was asking him, so do you think, is this something that you could have thought? Or is this something that, if I explain it to you, does it make sense? Can you challenge this argument? Or if I said, what do you think God is? And so on. And that tested, in a way, that confirmed to me that there is a capacity for reasoning that is of every human being, even very small children. We all, you know, some have more developed, some have other less developed, some can talk about it for a long time, but the instinct, the intuition, I think is there, and it's really important that it's there. And in part, this helps me answer your second question about propaganda, which is, yes, propaganda is really pervasive and really shapes us, but I don't think it ever fully shapes us. There is always a remainder, and this is a big philosophical question about how much of what we believe in is contextual and how much is shaped by what we are given to believe and how much can we frame ourselves. But to me, both propaganda is there, but there is also an urge for people who are subject to propaganda to resist that propaganda. They have questions. And sometimes it's about asking the right questions and finding the truth and interrogating adults in a way that leads them to answer you with certain responses. But I think, yeah, I don't think propaganda is so pervasive that people... So I'm convinced that, you know, in Nazi societies, in Russia right now, when the people who do wrong know they're doing wrong, they might feel they don't have a choice, or they might feel that, you know, the compromise they have to make is too high, but they know that it's wrong. And this is a very fundamental part of my beliefs philosophically, as to why I'm a Kantian, because Kant thinks that morality is something that you have inside you, and you know, your categorical imperative is there, and you know when you're doing something wrong that it's wrong. And that helps with resisting propaganda, with resisting this machinery and manipulation of reason.
I have a question regarding transnationalization. You mentioned you would like to have transnational states because civic nationalism failed. But isn't there a danger that this transnationalization with international organizations, with international big business, or with the surveillance capitalism, that you have what you don't want, an ethno-cultural or the religious culture nationalism? Isn't there a big danger? And maybe the positive part would be if we take away sovereignty from some states through this internationalization, that there's a chance to rebuild nation states, and then you give a chance to defranchise people, maybe even including women, migrants, etc., etc. These are the two questions.
Yeah, so I think about transnationalization, it's very important to me, at least to the proposals I make, that it's not transnationalization with capitalism. So I think I don't think you can have democracy with capitalism. And this is a very long discussion, but we can talk about the failures of representative systems. We can talk about the ways in which money in politics rigs the power game and makes certain voices a lot more explicit than others, about how power differentials, economic power differentials shape basically democratic representation at all levels. So I think there's a very long conversation around that, but that's where I start my critique of why I don't think if you care about democracy, you can have both democracy and capitalism. One has to go. And it may be that, you don't want democracy, you want to have capitalism, but I prefer to have more democracy and less capitalism. And this is why the transnational project that I talk about is not, it's not a transnational project that takes place within capitalist structures, because it's true that the international institutions that we have now are skewed towards rich capitalist states. They favor the core hegemonic Western countries and they deprive the poor people in the poor countries. And there is these asymmetries of power and wealth that work both within rich states, but also between rich states and poor states. And so if you're someone a country like Albania, in the world sphere, doesn't have the same power as a rich country like Switzerland, right? Even though there might be, in terms of population, there might be comparisons, but in terms of sheer negotiating power in international legal structures. So the project is one, as I say, of transnational democracy that starts from the bottom up and that tries to build a society that is beyond capitalism and that thinks about economic equality. Having said that, I don't think the only axis of inequality and asymmetry in current democratic systems is money and wealth. I think there are differences of race and gender and ethnicity, hierarchies of different kinds that need to be integrated into this critique of the system. So I don't think if you solve the class capitalism problem, you've solved all the problems of the world. There's axes of oppression that are still there, and this is why the project is one of democratization at all levels.
Is there another questions in the back?
Ja, Frau Ypi, ich rede auf Deutsch. Ich habe es etwas ähnlich wie Sie. My English is not so sophisticated that I can do my questions or my comments in English. Sehr vielen Dank für dieses tolle Buch. Ich habe es noch nicht gelesen, aber ich brenne richtig. Ich habe Sie verfolgt in verschiedenen Diskussionen im Fernsehen, in Interviewmagazinen und jetzt wieder heute. Das ist ganz etwas Tolles. Mein Hintergrund ist vielleicht so, ich kenne Albanien seit dieser Zeit, als Sie Albanien verlassen haben. Ich war 1998 das erste Mal in Albanien und seither bin ich eigentlich von diesem Albanian Virus attacked. Und dieser dieser albanische Virus ist nicht heilbar, da gibt es keine Impfung. Wenn man das mal hat, dann ist man da. Ich bin sehr viel in Albanien gewesen, ich habe viele Freunde. Was ganz interessant ist, das ist sehr authentisch, wie Sie natürlich berichten, auch diese ganze Geschichte aus Ihrer Kindheit. Ich kenne da sehr viel daraus. Und genau diese Diskussionen über Demokratie und Freiheit, die habe ich eigentlich so oft geführt in Albanien. Das sind Fragen, die aufgekommen sind. Und ich hoffe, Ihr Buch ist übersetzt auf Albanisch. Und mich interessiert eigentlich, was ist Ihre heutige Beziehung zu Albanien? Haben Sie sich auch schon überlegt, nach Albanien wieder zu gehen? Albanien ist ein Land im Moment, das sehr große Probleme hat, weil es gibt einen riesen Braindrop. Das heißt, sehr viele, eigentlich die besten Leute, die gehen und zurückbleiben Leute, die diese Art von Staat, die heute ist in Albanien, zurückbleiben und das erhält sich so. Das ist ein Riesenproblem und darum nimmt es mich wunder, was ist Ihre Beziehung heute zu Albanien?
Yeah, so I did translate the book in Albanian myself. And I spent a lot of time translating it, and I almost rewrote it because some things when I wrote in Albanian, I remembered them better. And so there's also some small changes between the English and the Albanian version, but that's for posterity to figure out. I did it also because I didn't want to have a book about Albania written in English for Western public. I didn't want to, there is a kind of imperialism of language. You know, you write in a dominant language and it's sold outside, and of course it's the success of the book is parasitic in it being written in a dominant language and translated more easily from English than it is from Albanian. But it was really important for me that it would not be brought to Albania by an intermediary, by the translator, that I would do it myself and I would sort of re-enter the story and rewrite the context. And so I felt like I had a debt to the country because I was being influenced and inspired, and my entire childhood had been there, and so I had a burden of responsibility to also write the book in Albanian, even though I wrote it in English in the first instance. And that rewriting of the book reconnected me with the country and also reminded me sometimes of why I had the commitments that I had. So Albania is really important to me because in some ways I come from Albania. Everything I am and do is conditioned by the fact that I was born in Albania and educated and grow up in Albania. But I had also been an immigrant for a very long time. And like every immigrant, kind of left the country behind me and was looking for another place to adapt and to integrate, which I still haven't found. Because I think if I were to say of the many identities I have, I lived in Italy and I lived in England and spent various periods of research everywhere, the strongest identity I feel I have is still Albanian. I don't think I ever got another identity from another country. I'm certainly not British. Maybe a little bit Italian, but more by cultural proximity. So I think I certainly feel a very strong connection to the country. But I don't feel that because of that strong connection, I have to return to the country or, you know, make a decision about returning or not returning because of that. And just in the way in which I don't think only politicians can do politics, I don't think that only people who live in a country can say things about the country or can talk about the country or advance the particular discourse in which the country features just because they're not there. So I think, culture is now deterritorialized and we live everywhere and work in other places. And so I don't have any immediate plans of returning to Albania. I almost feel like Albania is more present in me when I'm outside than when I'm inside, because when I go inside, I become part of different kinds of conversations, and I also find I work less well there, and there's too many coffees and too many chats and so on. So I think, yeah.
Thank you very much, Lea Ypi. I think that was a nice end of a very challenging and very inspiring talk. Thank you very much for all these informations you gave us in such a short amount of time. We will have a lot to think and to talk about. And Lea Ypi will sign books for you, so she will be here a little more. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich, dass Sie gekommen sind. Ich danke Ihnen auch ganz herzlich im Namen vom Schweizerischen Institut für Auslandforschung. Unsere nächste Veranstaltung ist am 7. Juni auch hier mit Nora Bosson und ihrem Sachbuch, ihrem war schon viel besprochenen Sachbuch, Die Geschmeidigen. Please join us then on 6th of June. And I would really thank you very much, Lea Ypi, for having been here and for talking to us and for sharing not only your book with us, but your really challenging thoughts about what democracy can be and what freedom is and should be. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Vielen Dank. Thank you.